Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a great winter break and is enjoying January in 2021 right now. So we're live again. We're not doing a full webinar series over this winter time period, but we are going to have our What's in My Backyard webinars from our Youth Advisory Council members. So please keep an eye out for announcements on that. We're going to have lots of different interesting webinars from our Youth Advisory Council members about what's in their backyard across Canada. So today we have Jaya, who is one of our Youth Advisory Council members who lives on Vancouver Island. And she is part of our Climate Change Committee on the Council, is very passionate about climate justice, the environment, and is lucky enough to have grown up on Vancouver Island. So she is wanting to share her backyard, which is the Salish Sea and the tidal pools. So please give a warm welcome to Jaya. Hello, Jaya. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Great. Did you want to just introduce yourselves to our audience?
Sure. So my name is Jaya, and I graduated with a degree in international relations, which doesn't exactly help me with this webinar, but that's okay. I got research skills. Um, and I live here in Victoria, BC, and I'm really excited to share with you some of my favorite places to go here on the island.
Great. And is there a little kind of disclaimer you wanted to give about your video?
So in this video, I do touch some of the sea anemones and small snails. And I just wanted to say this. Actually, it's okay to touch certain types of snails that are easily found in tidal pools, but you do have to be very careful. You don't want to lift them up too high. You want to keep them close to the ground. Be gentle. And if you're touching a sea anemone, don't touch the center. It's quite fragile, but it's okay to touch the tentacles, which makes quite
Outside?
yeah, and the column.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So we are going to play Jaya's video. So I hope you guys enjoy. It's about 20 minutes and has amazing video and footage of the beautiful sea creatures of the Salish Sea.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. The Jane Goodall Institute of Canada is happy to present What's in
My
Yard?
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Lekwungen and Tsimshian-speaking peoples, on whose territories I am an uninvited guest. This acknowledgement recognizes the distinct relationship that Indigenous nations have with the land, being its first caretakers. I believe that land acknowledgements are important openings because they inform how we move forwards as we live, learn, and do our work. In the context of this webinar, I will remember and communicate that the Suk and Chianu First Nations hold the rights to the land I was present on, and that this land has a history going back to time immemorial. Thank you for joining me in acknowledging the land and the people upon whose land we are present. So what is the Salish Sea? The Salish Sea includes the Strait of Georgia, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Puget Sound, and an intricate network of connecting channels and waterways. It is partially separated from the open Pacific Ocean by Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula. Contrary to the word sea, the Salish Sea is not exclusively an ocean ecosystem, but a watershed with interconnected lands, rivers, and streams. It is the mixing of the region's saltwater and many freshwater systems, essentially a large estuary that results in the sea's high biological productivity. The name Salish Sea is actually a very recent term. Marine biologist Bert Weber created it with the intention to raise consciousness about the region's waters and ecosystems in both Canada and the US. In March 2008, Chemainus First Nation proposed renaming the Georgia Strait the Salish Sea, which was approved by the British Columbia Office and Canada Board of Geographic Names. In the US, a parallel movement who renamed the Strait of Georgia, Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound the Salish Sea was successful. And so now we have the Salish Sea. This picture shows the beauty of the Salish Sea from the International Space Station. The Salish Sea sits within what is called the Georgia Depression, which formed out of the collision of continental plates 150 million years ago. This depression was then carved out further by the advance and retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet during the Ice Age. As the ice sheet retreated, the landscape filled with sea water. The Salish Sea is actually quite brackish, therefore, and it contains a significant mixing of fresh and salt water. Major rivers that flow into the Salish Sea include the Fraser, the Nisqually, the Nooksack, the Puyallup, the Skagit, the Snohomish, and the Squamish. The level of salinity varies throughout the water body depending on currents and the water flowing out of the rivers. There's a greater volume in winter and spring, and a lower volume in the summer. The Coast Salish are the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of this part of Turtle Island. Coast Salish is one of the main cultural and linguistic branches of the larger Salish group. This map from nativeland.ca does not represent or intend to represent official or legal boundaries of indigenous nations. It does show, however, approximate overlapping traditional territories of the nations of the area. The waterways of the Salish Sea have long been important trade routes and a source of food and resources for indigenous peoples. Here we are in Roche Cove. I wanted to come to Roche Cove because it is very protected. It is a cove on the Souk Basin, which is in itself a very sheltered harbor. The water in this cove is particularly brackish. As you can see, this stream is emptying into the cove, and Matheson Creek empties at the other side of the top end of the cove. I actually came here because in summer, there are loads of little mudflat crabs skittling along under the water at the shore's edge, which is very, very calm, as you can see. Alas, I did not know that true crabs go dormant and bury down in the winter at the shore. Though for some species of crabs, January is actually crab season. Here you can watch very small hermit crabs making their way through the shallow water around empty snail shells which have washed up. Crabs are decapods, meaning they have 10 legs. A very cool fact about crab dexterity: crabs are claw dominant as humans are left or right hand dominant. If a crab loses its dominant claw, the other claw will become dominant, so therefore they switch their dexterity as the other one regrows, and the newly dominant claw will stay dominant unless it falls off and the other one will become dominant and while it regrows. The coasts of Vancouver Island are home to mudflat crabs, purple shore crabs, and decorator crabs. I thought I read that wrong, but no, they're called decorator crabs. You can find these crabs under rocks and at the bottom of tidal pools at low tide. You can also find juvenile Dungeness crabs in deeper tidal pools, although Dungeness crabs typically live in deeper waters up to 180 meters deep. They are very popular on West Coast seafood menus. There's also not so friendly crabs in this area, and they are causing problems along the coast, as well as in the Souk Basin. Green crabs that threaten native crabs, clams, oysters, and mussels. They also bore into eelgrass, which is a marine plant that Dungeness crabs live in. They are invasive and very much overpopulated right now in the Souk Basin. Here we are at the shore of East Souk Park. East Souk Park encompasses the southernmost part of Vancouver Island. There's actually a point which demarcates where the border between Canada and the US turn, but that's further down the coast and along a hike. The very rocky shoreline is mostly cliffs or rocky outcrops. This is a rare sandy bay. Although low tides in winter occur in the nighttime and aren't as low as in the summer, daytime lows did allow me to explore what lives in some of the higher up pools. The water left in rocky crevices and small pools allows shoreline marine life to survive low tide until the water returns at high tide. This is no easy existence, however. While tide pools provide the oxygen, nutrients, temperature, space, salinity, and water needed, the organisms inside are exposed to intense sunlight in the summer, crashing waves all seasons, but especially in winter, and temperature variation between seasons. Even at this beach, there is a great variety of different ecosystems. You can see different wave action, strong and complicated currents make each tide pool its own ecosystem. There are dramatic interactions taking place within them. From afar, the winter shoreline looks serene, windswept, and a bit empty. But looking closer, we can see the magic of life. Sea anemones. Pink-tipped or aggregating anemones are incredibly common, and their range spreads from Alaska in the north to the north of Mexico. These are super resilient little creatures. They're not actually plants, although they spread almost like forest ground cover. They are, in fact, animals. Unlike most other anemones of the Salish Sea, they aren't only visible during extremely low tides. They can even be found at the zero tide height or higher. And therefore, they're the most common in most of what I saw out on my explorations. Anemones anchor themselves to a firm surface early in their life by secreting adhesive proteins. They can move in some circumstances, especially to avoid predation from starfish, but they typically stay in place and grow alongside one another. Sea anemones, particularly the pink-tipped anemone, lives in a symbiotic relationship with marine algae, which lives inside its body. The algae coats the anemones with their green and pink colors. The algae also provides nutrients and oxygen through photosynthesis. In return, the anemone offers the algae protection, and at their stems or bases can turn themselves to maximize sunlight exposure, therefore giving the algae more food. Anemones are actually predators. Their beautiful swaying appendages are actually two different types of tentacles, and both have the ability to sting. Slender feeding tentacles circle the central oral disc. Thicker, blunt-tipped fighting tentacles form a ring around the outer perimeter. On both, stinging cells snag, sting, and move drifting plankton, small crustaceans, aquatic insects, and floating debris into the mouth or oral disc of the anemone. Tiny harpoon-like structures are triggered and released in a fraction of a second. They release a paralyzing toxin. Here we can see I fed a tiny little snail to a couple of anemones, and you can see their tentacles fold in and move that snail into their oral cavity. Fun fact, anemones reproduce sexually, but they also clone themselves. Mature anemones can split in half as they stretch themselves out, like literally in two, and create two separate anemones. These anemones can repeat the process, and so therefore colonies can actually be made up of genetically identical clones. What's also really cool is that although they're all clones and they're all genetically identified, they're still individual animals, and they work together as a colony. Reproductive anemones are at the center, and they're defended by larger warrior anemones with stinging cells at the outsides. Small scout anemones around the perimeter are willing to die for the survival of the rest. Why is this important? Because sea anemones are territorial, and they literally go to war with one another. They dislike others. So anemones can sense members of foreign colonies approaching and will fight back using their fighting tentacles. Two colonies that grow too close will hurl harpoon stingers at one another. When the tide exposes anemones, a truce is reached temporarily. But in the water, the competition will continue until one colony is overwhelmed or outnumbered. This is incredible! You can actually see some of the scars on some colonies of sea anemones if you look carefully and when they're folded up to avoid the water. So I suggest if you're ever at a tidal pool, have a look for those. At low tide, anemones curl their tentacles inward and allow their exterior column to envelop them, protecting them from predators in the sun and the wind. Sea stars and sea slugs predate upon sea anemones as well as other sea anemones. And when I was mentioning they protect themselves from the water, they don't protect themselves from the water. It's when there's no water that they have to do this. Okay, so now we're going to talk about hermit crabs. Who does not love hermit crabs? They're super cute. But fun fact, hermit crabs are not true crabs. They don't grow up their own exoskeletons and molt as they get bigger, as real crabs do. Rather, they have soft, vulnerable abdomens, and they seek out abandoned snail shells to live in, switching them out for new ones as they grow in size. Hermit crabs pull themselves inside of the shells they find, and they pull not only their abdomen, but their 4 back legs. Their 6 walking legs stick outside, though they can pull them inside their shell if necessary to hide from predators. Their front legs end in claws, and they can use one claw to seal themselves inside their shell. They're very beautiful, and I managed to find a few, but they're also quite shy, so here we can see them retreat into their shell as they sense my shadow passing overhead. The Pacific red hermit and the black-eyed hermit crab are found less frequently than the wide-hand hermit crab, which has that larger claw it uses to seal itself inside its shell. We are still discovering new species of hermit crab in Pacific coast intertidal zones. As you can see, there are loads of tiny sea snails everywhere in these rocks and in the tidal pools. Tiny sea snails that you've been seeing are called turban snails. They're herbivores which eat microscopic films and macroscopic algae. Very slowly, you don't really see it, but they're there. They're eaten by sea otters as well as by humans. Though I've never eaten them, so I don't know how they taste. There are many species of sea snails, from the ones with the conical shells we saw in Rush Cove, to the very small ones we've been looking at, the turban snails, or the owners of the lovely shells we've seen inhabited by hermit crabs. Here's a little video of a snail slowly doing its thing. The frilled dogwinkle, or dogwelk snail, has a beautiful shell with frills. They are actually predatory snails and are able to drill into the hard plates of barnacles and eat them. Marine snails have a door, or operculum, that they use to seal themselves inside their shells for protection. You can see this dogwinkle shell seal itself inside its shell, and I had to unstick it, but gently. Remember, if you're picking up a snail or a small crab when you're exploring the ocean, to keep it low to the ground and replace it gently. The operculum also protects from receding tides as well as from predators. Limpets are gastropod mollusks with a cone-shaped or flattened shell. They have a muscular foot which helps them cling to rocks. And super cool, while they're found all over the world, the greatest diversity of them is found on the west coast of North America. They eat algae and microscopic diatoms on rocky surfaces. During the day, they remain motionless, but they move around at night. Some species will actually make what's called a home spot. If the rock is soft, they will make a spot on their rock by chewing out a depression in which their shell perfectly fits. If the rock is hard, then their shell will grow to fit the rock exactly. You can look up on the internet pictures of limpets and see what they look like on the inside. It's kind of creepy and a little bit alien, but they're a super important part of our ecosystem and important to monitor because they show us how well the algae and the diatoms are doing. While I was at the seaside, I happened to come upon a massive piece of bull kelp. This type of kelp, as you can see, grows to massive size. They form thick beds on subtidal rocks and create very large kelp forests. There are actually some cliffs off of East Souk from which you can see kelp forests. The water is deep enough. Bull kelp can grow to 36 meters tall. They are topped with a bladder containing carbon monoxide, which allows them to reach towards the light and stay upright. From the bladder grow numerous blades, which are like leaves of thick seaweed. And this is where photosynthesis occurs. Blades can grow 15 centimeters a day and reach 10 meters in length. Bull kelp love fast currents and form a habitat for many different plants and animals. There are also seaweed varieties that grow in tide pools. Seaweed is a general name for plants that grow in salt water and includes algae. In the intertidal zone, seaweed provides food for herbivores, a protective blanket when the tide is out, and a shelter when the tide is in. Seaweed attaches itself to a substrate. This can be a rock, other seaweed, or the shell of an organism. The flexible blades of the seaweed move with the water. Like most plants, seaweed is most visible and abundant during the spring and summer. Seaweed can be green, brown, or red, but all of it is capable of photosynthesis. Here we see some rockweed, which can survive at much higher tidal zones than other species. Its bladders are filled with a gel that has traditional use as a salve. Sea lettuce is a very common green algae found attached to rocks and free-floating in tidal pools. With warming temperatures, blooms of this algae are becoming worse and more destructive. As the algal blanket decomposes in the sun, It uses up oxygen and nutrients while changing the pH of shallow waters and releasing chemicals which are toxic to other organisms. A special type of red algae, which we have seen here at East Sooke Park, is of a coralline type. This is actually quite rare to see, and it's really cool we can see it here. For a long time, scientists did not know if these plants were corals or plants. But this type of seaweed sequesters calcium carbonate in its cell walls to create a coral-like coating. So they are plants, but they look like corals. Crustose forms look like pink splashes on the rocks, while articulated species are upright and branching. Barnacles might look a bit like limpets, but in fact they are crustaceans and closely related to crabs and lobsters. There are many species of barnacles, and they can live from 5 to 10 to even 20 years for the large species in intertidal zones. I think we'll see some really big ones who could be up to 20 years in this webinar. At their larval stages, barnacles swim freely in the ocean. However, as adults, they anchor to a hard surface and live in colonies. Barnacles attach themselves to rocks, buoys, ship hulls, and whales. Some whales carry up to a ton of barnacles. Barnacles secrete a cement-like substance to attach themselves to a substrate. This substance is one of nature's miracles. It can hold up to 60 pounds per square inch, and scientists are trying to recreate it for various human uses. Barnacles attach themselves permanently and build themselves plates. They also build inner plates that close and act as doors. These plates all grow as the barnacle does. When reached by the tide, barnacles open their doors and catch zooplankton by waving their feathery cirri in the ocean water. A unique type of barnacle, called the gooseneck barnacle, lives in protected areas, and these have a stalk. The shell extends up from the stalk, which is usually nestled in between rocks, and we can see some of those here. Barnacles are often found alongside mussels and limpets. At East Sooke, we can see a lot of thatched acorn barnacles, some giant acorn barnacles, and many goosenecked barnacles. Last but not least, I wanted to show you a very special work of art at East Sooke Park. The term petroglyph comes from two words, petro meaning stone and glyph meaning drawing. A petroglyph is a drawing in stone. This petroglyph is over 10,000 years old. It was made by the drilling of many small holes. This has allowed it to withstand wind, rain, and crashing waves over millennia. The petroglyph you see here was made by the ancestors of the Sooke and Chianu First Nations peoples, on whose traditional territory East Sooke Park is now located. It is thought to depict a seal, which is an important mammal and source of food. It is really remarkable to see it in person. It's actually quite large, and you don't quite get the full scale of it in the photo. And it's a good reminder that the coastline here has been home to Indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. Thank you for coming to this webinar, and I look forward to discussing with you and hearing your questions and trying to answer them. And I hope you had fun today exploring the Salish Sea intertidal zone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jaya. That was a great webinar. We really enjoyed that. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, we'll take those. So we do have one, Jaya. Do whales benefit from barnacle colonies that build up on them, making it like a symbiotic relationship?
That's a good question, and I can't give an exact answer because I don't think I'm qualified, but I don't think so. But I don't think they're bothered by them either.
So just kind of like a neutral, probably a neutral relationship. Well, thanks, David, for that question. And I have a couple questions too. So I'd love to know what your favorite part of Vancouver Island is. I am in Toronto and it's a snowstorm right now, so definitely not as beautiful and kind of almost this, not tropical, but kind of very mild weather that you, I know, have right now. So I'd love to hear what you love about living there.
Well, actually, I went to university in Ontario, and I loved the snow. That was my favorite part. But I think that my favorite part of living here is actually how close the nature is. Like when I went to both my middle school and my high school were close enough that you could go to the ocean at lunchtime. which is pretty special. And I can bike to provincial parks. It's so easy to go out and experience nature, which is so beautiful here. So
Mhm.
that's probably my favorite part.
Awesome. We have another question from the audience. So Anthony asks, does human presence on these beaches help or harm the tide pools? What are good and bad things that people do?
Now that's a good question. I suppose in my experience, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs, but I think that the more harmful human presence is actually like the greater contributions to ocean pollution, and this occurs on beaches as well. So those are obviously not good. A lot of these little animals are really quite strong. So, for example, unless you're stepping on barnacles, which I wouldn't recommend, they can cut your feet quite badly, or that sort of thing. That's definitely not good. But I would say largely your people aren't really doing that. As far as I've seen and in my experience, people are really respectful of tidal pools. They're great curiosities, great wonders
Mhm.
of nature. And what's more likely to be harmful is leaving behind garbage, etc., and the greater kind of problem of ocean acidification, which harms the
Mhm.
shells of these little creatures quite a lot.
Oh, yeah, no, I can imagine. And then why are you interested in the tidal pools? What kind of drew you to kind of do this webinar about them?
That's a good question. So when I was in elementary school, my mom actually came, and we would sometimes at lunchtime, she would take us to the beach because I live so close to the beach, and that I was just like amazed. It was a world. It is a underwater world that you get to look into, because a lot of the time the ocean's like kind of big and scary, but tidal pools are small and explorable. And I loved looking at tidal pools, so I wanted to learn a bit more about them and share that with the audience.
Awesome. So we have a couple more questions coming in. So Brian asks, what are the main differences, if any, between outer Vancouver Island ecosystems like Tofino or Yuki and inner islands like the Gulf Islands? I don't know if you happen to know.
I actually have not been to Tofino or Ucluelet, so I am a little bit of a, I don't know, not so well traveled maybe. Um, but my as far as what I can say would probably have a huge difference on the ecosystem is just how exposed it is to the Pacific, because the Gulf Islands are actually really quite sheltered, and
Hmm.
the waters are quite calm. Like even at you saw at Isuk, those waves aren't that big.
Hmm.
But in places like Tofino and Ucluelet, you have very large waves coming off the Pacific without any shelter. And so you can still have tidal pools in like rocks like Botanical Beach, etc. But I think that you're more likely to see large whales, although we do have
Hmm.
southern resident killer whales in the Salish Sea. And you're more likely to see like large ocean fish, etc. It's a bit more of the open ocean.
Yeah, so it's not as like this kind of confluence of like rivers and freshwater that are there. It's like just totally kind of open ocean. So likely
Yeah.
to see some differences in animals and plants and stuff. And then Renee had a question. Are sand dollars still prevalent on some of the beaches on Vancouver Island? She lived there as a kid and remember seeing many in Parksville and Colquitlam. I think I said that right.
Yes. I've been to Parkville and Coquitlam, and yes, they are still prevalent there. It kind of depends on the beach. I've noticed that sand dollars tend to like sandier beaches and especially lower tides. This was a bit of a high tide time that I went, and the winter has higher tides. But yes, there's still sand dollars, and there's still sea stars to be seen.
Awesome. All right, we have one more question. What was the most exciting observation you made when creating your video?
Um, so one thing actually that didn't get into the video is I did get to see like a beautiful deep sea mussel shell, and the pearlescent inside it was broken in half, so that was really nice to spot. And I think I had fun with the hermit crabs the most. They're just like, I don't know, they kind of explore and then they like go in their shells, and then they're very fun. So that
Awesome.
would be my
Cool. And then I would like you to share. So you're part of our Youth Advisory Council, which is 12 young women this year from across Canada who are kind of the youth voice and youth kind of support for Roots and Shoots. So I'd love for you to just kind of share what you have enjoyed most about being part of the Youth Advisory Council.
Hmm. I think I had a hard time thinking of one thing. This is like not easy because we're doing a lot of different things. And I think in a way that's kind of my favorite part is that like there's different ways we can all be involved. So like things like this webinar, but also sort of behind the scene things, like looking at the APE Fund grant applications and learning about all the projects across the country. But then we get also to do some more like event-based things. So I think it's just that dynamic of we've got large events going, but also like work behind the scenes, working with like international roots and shoots groups and learning what they're doing. It's quite cool in its breadth and its depth.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's I'm very impressed as the Roots and Shoots manager, kind of the work that your group has done this year. So if anyone wants to kind of check out more work that the Youth Advisory Council is doing, you can check on our Facebook page or Instagram or Twitter about our Living a Sustainable Year campaign that they have developed. So every month is a different issue about living sustainably. This month it's around plastic pollution, which is really important for the ocean because so many plastics do unfortunately get into our ocean systems. And there's some really good tips and tricks to reduce your plastic intake, be more kind of conscious about your use of plastic and good alternatives. So keep an eye out for that. We have different Living a Sustainable Year kind of challenges coming every month. So we'll have a new one coming in February, and we'll also have new webinars in our backyard series coming through the rest of the year till June. So thank you so much, Jaya. I wanted to say thank you again. That was great. I think we got a lot of interesting questions. We learned a lot. I learned a lot about tidal pools. I had no idea all these really cool little creatures live there, and it's super neat to see. So thank you so much, and we'll say goodbye here. Again, if you have any questions, you can also connect with us and learn more at rootsandshoots.ca. There's lots of information there about how to get involved in our programs, and you can learn all about kind of more of sustainability stuff there. So thank you, Jaya. We'll say goodbye, and thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you could join us for the next one.
Thank you.